Hey there, and welcome to Comedy Recapped. Today we'll be examining 1996's Multiplicity. Beware, spoilers ahead, watch out, and take care. A man, Doug, pulls up to the curb and storms out of his vehicle. He sees that his workers are doing a demo job on a driveway. Their work looks great, but it's the wrong driveway. He informs his worker, Vic, that it's supposed to be the house next door. Doug then instructs Vic to fix both driveways before storming off. That night, Doug returns home with his family, where his wife, Laura, mentions that he missed his daughter's show. Feeling overwhelmed, he explains to Laura how Vic had messed up the job earlier that day. He also mentions that he might have to fire Vic. He then informs her that his boss had given him the responsibilities Vic handled to add to his workload. At this point, Laura gets frustrated and asks if he can't just refuse the extra responsibilities, especially since their kids barely see him around lately. Doug sighs and then mentions that it's impossible to refuse the responsibilities if he wants to keep the job. The next day, Laura gets a call from a former colleague of hers who gives her a job offer. She mentions this to Doug and states that she's interested in working again. Doug, however, states that that'll just make things worse, since if she takes the job, neither of the parents would be around for the kids anymore. A while later, Doug and his team are working at a research facility. A leak occurs that ends up ruining all their previous work, resulting in Doug getting cranky and pissed at everyone. An old man watches Doug as he tries to salvage some of the soaked construction plans to no avail. After watching him for a while, the man walks up to Doug and then introduces himself as Dr. Lead. He also mentions that Doug's job must be tough. He converses for a while with Doug about Doug's life and then mentions that Doug doesn't have to live this way and that he can help Doug out. At this point, Doug asks what they do at the research facility, and Dr. Lead simply smiles as he responds, "We make miracles." A couple of days later, Doug visits Dr. Lead at his home. Dr. Lead explains the nature of his job, stating that he makes clones, and he has been working on cloning technology for 15 years. Doug smiles and then he gets up to leave. At this point, someone who looks exactly like Dr. Leeds walks into the room. He greets Doug, and both he and the previous Dr. Leeds explain that one of them is a clone and the other is the original. They also explain that they can do the exact same thing for Doug for free. Later that day, Dr. Lead takes Doug to a lab where they cloned him. Doug takes his clone home and names him Doug 2. He hides number 2 in the apartment above his home and informs him that he'd be staying there. He also informs number 2 to never let Laura or either of the kids see him. The next day, Doug gets to work to find that number 2 has already made it to the office. Doug rushes out of the office to prevent anyone from seeing both him and his clone simultaneously. He calls number 2, and they both decide for number 2 to handle work while Doug handles everything at home. Doug, who suddenly has free time for the first time in a long while, decides to go watch his son's football match. At the match, the coach gets frustrated with the team and decides to quit, stating that he doesn't get paid for the job. He makes Doug the new coach as he storms off the field. Laura returns home and is shocked to find Doug preparing dinner for the family. Zach, their son, immediately mentions how awesome Doug is as their new football coach, stating that the team scored for the first time in forever. Surprised that he had the time to watch the match, Laura asks Doug how he managed to do it. Doug replies that he got an assistant to help with his job. He also states that he totally trusts his new assistant. Doug kisses Laura and then informs her that he's down with her taking the job. A month later, Laura meets up with Doug at a restaurant for a date. Sometime into the evening, Doug mentions that he's tired of how much work he's been doing at the house and that he wants things to return to how they were before Laura took her job. Laura gets annoyed at this and refuses Doug's offer. While discussing this with Laura, Doug sees number 2 at a different table on a date with a coworker. He immediately makes up an excuse and then leaves to use the restroom as number 2 does the same. Doug confronts number 2, mentioning that he, number 2, is cheating on Lauren by going on that date. Number 2 gets pissed and states that he works and works but never gets to see his wife and kids, nor does he have any friends to hang out with, so of course, he'd go on a date. A couple of days later, Doug visits number 2 with another clone, number 3. Number 2 immediately opposes, saying there is no need for a new clone. However, Doug explains that while number 2 deals with work-related stuff, number 3 would deal with the kids and the house, leaving him the opportunity to have some time for himself. He also states that now number 2 wouldn't be lonely anymore, instead he'd have a friend and roommate. Doug returns home late a couple of days later and sneaks into his bedroom only to find number 3 in bed with his wife. He gets pissed off and demands an explanation from number 3. Number 3 quickly explains that nothing happened between him and Laura. He also explains that they simply slept in the same bed together. Still pissed off at the entire situation, Doug makes a rule for the clones, stating that no one except the original sleeps with Laura. A couple of nights later, Doug wakes up to music blaring from the clones' room. He rushes there to find the clones having a party with 2 ladies. He gets the ladies to leave and then confronts the clones, stating that they can't just bring strangers into the house. At this moment, Doug notices a 3rd clone in the apartment with them and requests an explanation from number 2 and 3. They both explain that they visited Dr. Leeds and had him clone number 2 so the clone could take care of the mundane day-to-day tasks. Doug then asks what is wrong with number 4 as he notices him acting weird. Number 3 explains that due to number 4 being a clone of a clone, he's a bit special in the head. Realizing the potential issues that might develop from this, Doug creates another rule for the clones: no more cloning. The next night, Laura confronts Doug. She states that she's been worried because she's been noticing some strange things during the last couple of months. She also mentions that he's been acting weird, forgetting things they discuss and acting like different people at different moments. At this point, she stops and asks if he has double personalities or has bipolar disorder. Doug convinces her that he's alright and then asks her to go on a sailing trip with him. Laura, however, refuses, stating that Doug doesn't know how to sail and that they can't just leave on a trip so impromptu. The next morning, however, Doug announces to the clones that he's going on a trip and needs them to cover for him full time. He also stresses the 2 rules, stating that they must never be broken nor bent in the slightest. He leaves for the trip and returns the next day to find that Laura and the kids were nowhere to be found. The clones inform him that Laura got annoyed and left for her father's house with the kids. They also inform him that number 2 had gotten sick, so number 3 had to stand in for him at work, which led to their getting fired. At this point, number 3 also mentions that Laura can be very determined and that she had thought he was Doug, which led him to having fun in the sheets with her. Even though he did try not to. Number 2 and 4 also say the same thing. Number 4 tells Doug that Laura had cried and mentioned that he never fulfilled his promises, that she doesn't know if he still loves her. Doug gets excited and runs out of the house. He returns hours later in a truck filled with construction supplies. He convinces the clones to help him fulfill the oldest promise he had made to Laura: fixing the house. He also gets Vic to help them fix the house. Once they finish renovating the house, Doug visits Laura at her father's. He begs her to come home with him, where he displays the renovated house to her and apologizes for his recent behaviors. Laura forgives him and returns home with their kids. The clones decide to leave Doug and start their life separately from him. They travel to Florida, where they start a pizza business named The 3 Brothers. That's gonna wrap up this recap. We hope you've enjoyed it. If so, please click the subscribe button with notifications turned on so you don't miss a single video.